In shamanic tradition, there's the notion of soul loss and the remedial practice, of course, of soul retrieval. And we might see that shadow work, energy loss, and illuminating a sanctuary for the lost orphans of psyche and soma to return home to, that these ideas, while maybe not exactly the same, are resonant with one another. And there was a time some years ago, when my therapy practice largely consisted of women and men who were deeply committed to their spiritual lives, yogis and yoginis and meditators of one flavor or another. And despite the many genuine benefits that they were experiencing in their study and their practice, they would describe to me ways in which their realizations were somehow not filtering down into their intimate relationships, their sexuality, their parenting, their relationship to money or work, creativity, career, and even in their physical health. And some were also struggling with psychological and emotional difficulties, things like anxiety or panic, depression, OCD, loneliness, a deep sense of meaninglessness, including, narcissistic and borderline type experiences, splitting, dissociative disorder, and at times true spiritual emergency and a break with reality altogether. And they were understandably suffering and confused by this. And I knew some of these experiences myself quite well. And the confusion that can come with having genuine spiritual insight and realization on the one hand, which is coexisting with some really difficult psychological and emotional experience on the other. I mean, there's an assumption, which is usually unconscious, or maybe it's just a deep hope, that our engagement with spirituality, which can and does open us to very authentic experiences of wisdom, insight, clarity, and love. But this assumption that this will automatically resolve our trauma and attachment wounding, or remedy an underlying sense of shame or low self-worth, or heal any narcissistic injury we may have experienced, or transform that primordial sort of terror that so many of us have of true intimacy and of being abandoned, that it will, by its nature, eliminate obsessive, compulsive, and addictive behaviors and help us really to take care of ourselves, to assert our needs, to enact healthy boundaries. But what I and many others, of course, have come to discover is that whatever psychic, emotional, or somatic material that we're not able to be in a conscious, embodied, and compassionate relationship with will affect our perception and our experience in ways that we aren't usually aware of. And the truth is, at least in my experience, that spiritual practice isn't always able to get at this more relational material. It just wasn't designed to do that, not in its classical forms anyway. And this isn't a fault of those teachings and practices, not the way I see it anyway, but just a recognition of how vast and how multi-layered the human psyche and soma truly is. I mean, there's a basic understanding or an idea in the psychoanalytic therapies, which goes something like, everything that we're unable to access, to verbalize, and to integrate will eventually be located in the other. We'll find it there. Or it will be enacted within the relational field between ourselves and another person. or between ourselves and a culture or a society. Or the third option is that it will become somatized in our bodies, where the lost orphans take up residence in our cells, in our muscles, in our organs, in our posture, in our habitual ways of moving our bodies, and in our patterns of breathing, and in all sorts of autonomic activation. I mean, I think we all know that an experience, say, of anxiety, of what we call anxiety, can take expression psychologically as intrusive patterns of thinking or as a particular mood. But it also has a physical component to it, doesn't it? And in order to really work with anxiety, we're going to have to tend to it across all of the various layers. We can't leave the body out, which sometimes happens in spiritual and even a lot of therapeutic work. And so the basic idea that the therapeutic traditions invite us to explore is that we all have a set of strategies and defenses that we've built up over decades, perhaps longer, to keep us out of an embodied, conscious relationship with our own wounding, our own trauma and anxiety and emotional pain. And just say it one more time, maybe, so it's clear, and this is really important, I think, is that this protective organization it's not evidence of how unevolved or unawakened or unspiritual we are. No apology, no shame, no blame here. But what it is evidence of is a certain form of intelligence, of our best and most creative early attempts to take care of ourselves, which is honorable, which is noble. So we can let go of the shame and the judgment and the attack that so many of us have regarding our historic core vulnerabilities and sensitivities. They're worthy of some respect and some honor, actually, as they've served an incredibly necessary and adaptive, even life-saving function. I mean, in other words, these strategies, to go back to Jung and the quote that we started with, they come into being and are kept alive to protect us from that direct meeting with our own shadow, with those parts of ourselves and our experience that we've dismissed or rejected or had to reject, as unworthy, unacceptable, and unsafe. I mean, to really let them in, to embrace and hold and integrate them would require that we come face to face again with all of that anxiety that our strategies have helped us to stay out of. And who really wants to deal with all that? I mean, in this is interesting, and in my experience, while on the conscious level, like what I say to myself, we all want to transform and heal and awaken, but there's always going to be a part of us that has an unconscious investment in not healing. Because we know at a deep level, I believe, what that's going to require, that in order to truly heal, we're going to have to touch and feel and integrate all of that anxiety, that hurt, that tenderness, that sensitivity that our protective strategies have kept us out of all these years. And we may even be carrying that burden for our entire family system. And this is why the path of transformation and healing can feel so contradictory at times. Do you know what I mean? I want to heal. That's the conscious presentation, and that's valid. That's honorable, that's respectable, that's authentic. And the unconscious has its say in the matter. Like, hey, wait a minute. What that true healing is going to require, there's some trepidation about that, which also makes a lot of sense. And so it's important And it's also just compassionate and also kind to honor the reality that at times we're not necessarily going to want to do this work, that we can expect to have some resistance to it, and bring some compassion to ourselves in response, honoring what we're really asking ourselves to do when we embark on this path, which is one of a radical, evolutionary, revolutionary courage and trust. And it's going to require that we train ourselves slowly over time to tolerate and contain the experience of anxiety or groundlessness, if we want to use a more less clinical term. I mean, in this way, even anxiety, even that shakiness, that groundlessness is the prima materia, the material that's required for deep and lasting transformation. It's such a radical thing to ask ourselves, to consider anxiety as path, to consider that groundlessness as ally, or from an alchemical perspective as the prima materia, as the emanation of Mercurius, of Hermes, Hermes coming with his wand. He's always around somewhere. Usually when the shadow is spoken about, it's with regard to, these more negative aspects of our personalities. Things like our anger or selfishness, our tendencies toward self-absorption or to get inflated, or jealousy or greed, our codependency, our arrogance, our fear, our addictions, our shame. But it's important to remember, and this is often left out, that it's not only so-called negative material that ends up in the shadow, but any part of our personality that is unacceptable, unwanted, and has been rejected or marginalized by those around us, including by our cultures, our societies, our religions, our political and educational systems. We can also disown or split off from our own natural creativity, sexuality, even our capacity to feel joy, to enjoy a simple moment of being alive, or to engage in spontaneous, unstructured, unproductive play and imagination. I mean, one thing I've seen in my clinical work is just how so many of us have lost the capacity to play and to be unproductive and to dream. And how much anxiety is there, if we're not accomplishing something. And of course, this can bleed over into our spiritual lives, can't it? Which can also become yet one more unending project of self-improvement and accomplishment. And the reason any of this experience, positive or negative, becomes unwanted and pushed away is because at some point in our developmental history, in our families of origin, in our early peer groups or school settings or whatever, the embodiment and expression of this material became associated with something unsafe, something that generated unworkable or potentially fragmenting psychic and somatic states of anxiety, of panic, of terror. Meaning, if we allowed ourselves to feel, to articulate and express our anger or sadness or too much dependency or unbridled joy or excitement or fear or creative expression, whatever it is for us. Say this led to a rupture in the bond with one of our caretakers or attachment figures. As a young child, our number one priority is keeping that bond intact. Even if it's a terrifying and an unhealthy bond. As painful as this is, even if it's a bond oriented in abuse, because that's our only chance at survival. And we learned very quickly which feelings and perceptions and sensitivities and ways of being led to rejection, shame, and abandonment. And also which led to connection, to affection, to acknowledgement, to love. And so I think Jung's point, and to use an alchemical metaphor, is that we can't just go straight to the philosopher's stone, to the gold, focusing only on the light, the ascending current, the solar upward aspects of the path, directly into the heavens of unity and oneness. I mean, as tempting as that is. And what he's saying here is that there is a journey that we're each going to be asked to make, that we have to make. If we want to know that, if we really want to know that golden full spectrum nature of who and what we are, which is wild and alive and whole. And I think, as many of us know, this journey can be really messy. It's not always going to feel flowy and loving and nurturing and clear. At times it'll be chaotic, uncertain, and feel as if we've been forsaken and the light has fallen away. I mean, there are times when it can seem as if everything is falling apart, where what we know is being washed away, which is that alchemical process of solutio, of dissolution, which is a holy, sacred process. But it's not seen that way necessarily from the perspective of ego. I mean, from the ego's viewpoint, it pretty much sucks. That's a technical term. Ego here just pointing to what it is that I already know, what I'm consciously aware of, how I've come to imagine myself, others in the world. I mean, you might think about it this way. If we've spent decades organizing our experience around never feeling angry or lonely or ashamed or dependent or independent or assertive or humble or whatever our particular core vulnerability is. And then through our inner work, our prayer, our meditation, our yoga, our alchemical work, our therapy, we start to open to meeting those lost pieces of soul who have been carrying these energies and these experiences on our behalf from the underworld. There's a real likelihood that this reunion with the lost ones, that this isn't going to feel safe. I mean, how could it? Nor is it likely something we're going to want to do in the moment anyway. And it's important to know that ahead of time. And then we can discover perhaps that even though it doesn't feel safe, like at the level of feeling, that we are in fact safe at a deeper level, that ultimately the reunion with the lost pieces of soul is safe. In fact, it's the very root and foundational ground of safety, that there cannot be a felt sense of safety without that type of integration, without that felt sense of wholeness. But we have to make the journey. It has to be embodied and experiential for us. We can't take anyone's word for it. We have to be in relationship with the materials in the laboratory of the body and the nervous system. We can't work outside the vessel or on the sidelines at the level of theory and idea. It's just not intimate or sensual or tactile enough.